November 29th, 2006, Ridgeland, Mississippi. It's just past 8:30 p.m. in this tranquil suburb of Jackson. In her house on Old Square Court, 37-year-old Sabrina Coleman is settling in for the night when she's startled by an unusual noise.
She just hears this horrendous pounding on her front door. She thought somebody was actually trying to break in the front door of her house. She realizes that it's her neighbor, Keon, is standing at the door.
Avis been shot, call 911.
Sabrina phones emergency responders. Within minutes, Ridgeland police arrive on the scene. In the garage of Keon's house, they make a horrifying discovery.
The carport door is open. They see Keon Pittman there in the garage next to the body of Avis Banks.
27-year-old Avis Banks is Keon Pittman's fiancée. She's lying in a pool of blood. After ushering Keon away from her body, police check Avis's vital signs, but it's clear there's no saving her.
She was savagely attacked.
Gunshot to the thigh, gunshot to her buttocks area. She had a gunshot into her chest cavity, and then there was a lethal gunshot wound behind her left ear.
But the gunshot wounds aren't the only injuries Avis has suffered.
Her neck had been slashed, she had been stabbed.
She had a total of 4 stab wounds.
It's a gruesome scene, made even more tragic by what a devastated Keon Pittman tells Detective Frank Dillard.
We were informed that she was at least 5 months pregnant.
You wonder who in the world would do something like this.
Especially to someone as beloved as Avis. The middle of 3 daughters, Avis was raised in a devout Christian household in Vicksburg, Mississippi.
She did girly things, but mainly she would go to school, come home, do her homework, read the Bible, and go to bed.
She was a sweet, loving, kind person.
Avis's parents were of modest means, but they had high hopes for her.
She grew up with 2 great parents, a blue-collar family. Her family was especially proud of her. She was the first member of her family to go into complete college.
She had gotten her degree, with the early childhood education. Her goal was to open up her own daycare center.
Avis was passionate about being a preschool teacher, but she also had big dreams of having a family of her own.
She wanted a family. She wanted a house full of kids.
She wasn't the go out and party type girl. It was family first with Avis.
Which explains why Avis was instantly drawn to Keon Pittman. The two initially met at a fitness club.
He approached her and, asked her name. He did mention the fact that she was attractive. She kind of blushed and giggled. Well, they talked for a little while and they exchanged numbers. I think what attracted Avis to Keon was his charm.
Keon also shared Avis's passion for educating children. He taught middle school science and coached basketball.
Once we found out Avis was a teacher, I was like, okay, could be a little match.
After just a few weeks of dating, Avis felt the time was right to introduce Keon to her parents. He definitely made a good first impression.
Avis's parents liked Keon because he seemed to take good care of their daughter, and their daughter cared about him. He looks like somebody who would be a great dad and a great husband.
Keon and Avis were madly in love. But just a year into their relationship, Keon accepted a teaching position at a middle school in Jackson, 45 miles away. He asked Avis to come with him. Avis had some reservations about living with a man out of wedlock, but Keon promised to make it official.
They were planning on being married in January 2007.
Once in Jackson, Keon quickly settled into his new position. The couple decided to buy a 2-bedroom house in a suburb of Ridgeland.
Ridgeland's family-oriented and just a small community where you feel like you can trust people.
Everybody knows everybody, it seems like.
A few months later, the couple had some more big news to share.
When Avis did call to tell me that she was pregnant, I was very excited. Avis was very happy. She was ready to go out and start buying clothes and toys. We were looking forward to our children growing up together and having the bond and the relationship that she and I had.
As Avis began prepping the house for the arrival of their first child, Keon took a second job, bartending nights at a restaurant called On the Border.
Keon wanted to provide for Avis. He wanted to have the best, and he did give her the best.
With a love that seemed to know no bounds, it seemed to Avis and Keon were living a dream life together, which made the nightmarish scene inside their garage the night of November 29, 2006, that much harder to fathom. As Detective Dillard and the other homicide investigators survey Avis's mutilated body, a sense of outrage overtakes them.
I said a prayer. Lord, let me find who did this.
But what investigators don't know is that before they can bring Avis's killer to justice, they'll have to untangle an intricate web of sex, lies, and betrayal, and a shocking motive that points the finger at the unlikeliest of suspects. A new house, pending nuptials, a baby on the way. Avis Banks and Keon Pittman are looking forward to spending the rest of their lives together.
Avis was very happy with Keon. Avis was happy with the way the relationship was progressing.
Avis loved that boy.
But this fairy tale romance came crashing down the night of November 29th, 2006. Avis lies dead on the cold floor of her garage. Her body is riddled with bullets. She's also been stabbed repeatedly, and her throat has been slashed. And as for Keon, he's beside himself with grief. As they survey the scene, investigators are struck by the location of Avis's body.
Avis's body was laying on the ground next to the front tire, laying on her back. It looked like she had just gotten out of her car, was approaching the door of the residence when the suspect opened up the door and surprised her.
Could Avis's death be the byproduct of a botched robbery? Judging from the scene investigators encountered inside the house, that appears to be the case.
The residence appears to have been ransacked.
Electronics have been turned over and dressers have been emptied out.
It looked like maybe this was, in fact, a burglary that may have been interrupted by Avis coming home.
Near the back of the house, investigators spot the burglar's likely point of entry.
The back door had been kicked in at the house. There was a shoe print left on that back door.
The shoe print seems like further evidence that a robbery has taken place. But in another part of the house, homicide detective Lieutenant John Neal makes a curious discovery.
There was a master bathroom, and there were some under cabinet doors that were left open where you would keep your bathroom cleaning stuff. And I worked burglaries for 24 years, and I don't ever know of any burglar who has gone into a bathroom looking for valuable items.
And as he and the other detectives make their way through the rest of the house, Lieutenant Neal realizes that even though the place has been ransacked, nothing of value seems to be missing, which begs another question.
If this was just a residential burglary, why even attack Avis? You had every opportunity to go and leave prior to her coming into the house.
This discovery, coupled with the brutal nature of Avis's injuries, has Lieutenant Neal rethinking the robbery angle.
We felt like, based off the injuries inflicted on her body, that this was somebody who was close to Avis. We felt like this was personal.
But who in the world would hold such a deadly grudge against a kind-hearted mother-to-be like Avis? Detectives turn to her fiancé, Keon Pittman, to help answer that question.
When you have a crime such as this, you always start with that inner circle, people closest to your victim, to figure out what your victim is like and what they do, and then you work out from your circle, trying to identify suspects.
Though he seems heartbroken by Avis's death, Keon pulls himself together and retraces the events leading to the discovery of Avis's body. According to this mild-mannered teacher and coach, this basketball team had practice at 5, roughly the same time that Avis was scheduled to get off work.
He called Avis and he said he would pick up some things from the grocery store and cook because she didn't feel like it. She was 5 months pregnant.
Keon tells the investigators that basketball practice wrapped up around 7:30. After that, he picked up the groceries and headed home.
And once he let the garage door up, you see Avis's body laying there beside her car.
According to Keon, he rushed to Avis's side.
Avis! Wait a minute.
With Avis unresponsive, Keon ran next door and urged Sabrina Coleman to get help.
Avis has been shot. Call 911, please.
Keon's story seems genuine, but investigators still need him to come down to the station and give a formal statement.
He was brought to the police station to be interviewed, was mainly just to get a good written statement from him to lay out some basis for his timeline, where he was, where Avis was, what was going on in her life at that time.
But in speaking with Keon, investigators are struck by a couple of odd details.
Someone did mention, why didn't you just use your own cell phone? He said he never thought about that, but he just ran to the neighbor's house.
As they ask these questions, the detectives notice that Keon's demeanor begins to change. He now seems more agitated than grief-stricken.
Tell me what's going on.
He's not showing the behavior of a person who had just lost a loved one.
I don't like this little bro. You don't like being up. I'd rather be back downstairs.
He was constantly on his cell phone. They want me to use the bathroom, or I can't do this, I can't do that. Finally, I reminded him, hey, you have a dead fiance and your unborn child is in her stomach and they're dead.
I don't know nothing, man. More than you going out. I don't know nothing. You the one in here asking me these questions, man. I don't know nothing.
Keon's peculiar behavior prompts detectives to slide a Miranda warning in front of him. Keon refuses to sign it and accuses the police of trying to pin the murder on him.
I'm not gonna sign that because you could easily go back and write in your charges. Well, y'all trying to charge me with something. That's the way it's looking. I really don't like the situation at all. I'd rather have a lawyer here or someone.
He wanted to talk to a lawyer immediately.
Could nice guy Keon Pittman have something to do with his fiance's murder? It hadn't appeared that way at first, but now investigators are having second thoughts.
When Keon reached out to his attorney, it kind of struck us as odd. It kind of made us change our focus a little bit to maybe dig into him a little bit more to see what he was about.
But just as they begin to wonder if Keon Pittman might be involved in his fiance's death,
I don't know nothing, man.
a new suspect emerges. One who casts the investigation in an entirely different light. "24 hours have passed since mother-to-be Avis Banks was brutally gunned down in the garage of the home in Ridgeland, Mississippi, that she shares with the love of her life and husband-to-be Keon Pittman.
My first emotion was, who would do this? Why would you kill a pregnant lady?
I said, who would shoot Avis? Everybody love Avis. Avis don't bother nobody.
Police initially suspect a robbery gone awry, but after exhibiting strange behavior during his formal statement, Avis's fiancé, unassuming school teacher Keon Pittman, has become the focus of the investigation. Detectives obtain a copy of Keon's cell phone records, wondering if they might place him at home at the time of the crime, rather than wrapping up basketball practice at Chastain Middle School.
We're able to get locations that his cell phone was during various times he was making telephone calls.
Keon's phone records confirm his original story, that he was at the school at the time of the crime. A number of eyewitness accounts further solidify this alibi.
There were some folks saying that he was there at the school, at the gym, between 5:45 and 6 o'clock when Avis was killed. It was a pretty solid alibi from the police point of view.
However, Keon's cell phone records reveal a side of him no one knew existed.
Through his cell phone records, we were able to see that there was several women that he was involved in.
It's clear from the text messages that these relationships weren't just innocent flirtations. Some of them seem like full-blown affairs.
Keon is a womanizer. That's what it boils down to.
Keon's cell phone records also make it clear Avis knew about her fiancé's extracurricular activities.
There was a text message that was discovered on his phone that was from Avis to where she was questioning his commitment to the relationship. We felt like maybe she had discovered that there were other women involved in his life.
But none of her immediate family can fathom the notion that Keon was unfaithful.
There was love there between Avis and Keon. He loved Avis and Avis loved him.
They were in love. They wanted to raise a family together.
He was a college graduate, a hard worker. He looks like somebody who would be a great dad and a great husband and supportive of his family.
Keon's fellow teachers say the same thing.
Keon Pittman is described as a well-liked teacher down there. He gets along well with everybody.
Lieutenant Neal and Detective Dillard decide to speak with Keon's co-workers at his other place of business, On the Border Bar and Grill. Perhaps they've noticed Keon paying special attention to some of his female customers. Keon's fellow bartenders can recall only one.
Well, there's one that sees him a lot.
A woman who comes in nearly every night Keon works. Her name is Carla Hughes. So how did Keon come to know Carla Hughes? The answer comes as a surprise to investigators.
They think that they work together at Chestnut Middle School.
The name Carla Hughes didn't come up in detectives' initial conversation with Keon's fellow teachers.
Anything I could do, you let me know on that one.
But a little digging reveals there's a 6th grade teacher at the school by that name. And like Keon, she's new to the staff.
Okay, guys, remember to do your homework on Thursday.
She moved to Jackson around July of 2006 to become a teacher at Chastain Middle School. Carla was regarded as a very professional teacher. Super smart, just helpful, caring, dedicated.
Carla certainly doesn't sound like the type to be involved with a man who's engaged to another woman. But just in case, detectives decide to pay a visit to the school's principal.
Tell us a little bit about Keon. How long have you been here?
The plan is to see if the principal has heard rumors of an alleged affair between Keon and Carla. But before they can ask that question, investigators are interrupted by a surprise visitor.
While I'm talking to the principal, lo and behold, Carla comes in, hysterical. She's crying.
Where's Keon? Is he okay? What happened to him?
Unprompted, Carla announces she's beside herself about the death of Keon's wife and unborn child. But her reaction seems a bit too dramatic.
I found that to be highly unusual.
Detectives ask Carla to accompany them to the station for a formal interview.
If you'll let me finish up here, I'd love to talk.
Carla agrees. Sitting across from Carla in the interrogation room, detectives can see why a man, even one who's spoken for, would be attracted to her.
She was very outgoing, very attractive girl, kind of athletic, but very attractive. She would be one of the ladies you would notice.
Carla Hughes is a beautiful woman. She appears to have it all.
Raised in Greenville, Mississippi, Carla is the epitome of an all-American girl.
She was involved in band, cheering, tennis, soccer, student body organization. She was Miss Washington County Junior Miss and Miss Greenville Teen.
After high school, she went to University of Southern Mississippi in Hattiesburg. She graduated with honors.
But if Carla Hughes is the all-American, put-together woman everybody claims she is, why would she even consider having an affair with a man whose fiancée is pregnant? And if the suspicions are true, and Carla and Keon are sleeping together, what does their relationship have to do with the murder of Avis Banks?
She may know things that can get us to talk to him, or then we can probably extract information from her.
They were pushing her about her relationship with Keon.
How close would you say that you are?
We're just friends. We work together.
She was saying that her and Keon was just friends, no romantic relationship.
When pressed by detectives, Carla admits that she often visits Keon at work. These revelations, coupled with statements given by Keon's co-workers at On the Border, convince detectives that Carla and Keon are more than just friends. and they press Carla to admit it.
Won't lie to me about this.
I'm not.
Okay. Were you two involved with each other?
Yes.
According to Carla, the relationship started innocently enough, just two young teachers trying to fit in at a new school.
He was kind of taking her in, showing her the ropes of that new job.
Though Carla claims it didn't take long for that friendship to turn into something else.
They started sending notes via students. Keon just paid her so much attention. That really is what kind of hooked her in. Keon and Carla's relationship heats up really quickly. I believe like the second time he came over, they wound up having sex.
Pretty soon, Carla and Keon are hooking up at every possible opportunity.
They're meeting up after school. She's going to the restaurant where he bartends.
Detectives inform Avis's family of Keon's infidelity. Needless to say, they're floored.
Everything that I thought about him changed. And the only thing I could think of was, why would you waste a perfect relationship to go out and do this?
Keon Pittman is a snake in the grass.
But how does Keon's alleged infidelity factor into the murder of his fiancée? With no further questions, detectives tell Carla Hughes she's free to go. But within hours of doing so, a surprise phone call comes in.
Hello?
And sends the investigation in a new direction. A direction that will ultimately lay bare the hidden desires and unchecked obsessions that led to the murder of Avis Banks.
Hello.
It's now been 48 hours since Keon Pittman discovered the body of his pregnant fiancée, Avis Banks, in the garage of their home in the Jackson, Mississippi suburb of Ridgeland. After initially focusing on a possible robbery motive, police have shifted their attention to Keon, or more precisely, to his fellow teacher, Carla Hughes, who, despite her intelligence and striking good looks, has admitted to having an affair with Keon.
Were you two involved with each other?
Yes.
After releasing Carla, detectives question her friends and family and discover a possible motive Carla might have for wanting Avis Banks dead. Like Avis, Carla was engaged to be married until her fiancé called it off at the last minute.
The man that she was supposed to marry when she got pregnant didn't stand by her side, and I think that left really a bitter taste in her mouth.
Is it possible that Avis Banks was murdered by Carla Hughes so that Carla could live the fairy tale life with Keon instead of Avis?
She saw the things that Keon did for Avis. She made her want the things Avis had in her life.
The fact that Keon was standing beside his pregnant fiancée and supporting her, I think Carla was jealous of that.
But you told me you love me, though. Don't try to make me the bad guy. I don't want to hear none of this stuff about love and all that stuff. You knew what this was.
To detectives, it looks increasingly like Carla Hughes had ample motive to murder Avis Banks. That's when they receive another unexpected call.
Hello?
This one from a local attorney.
The attorney had a client in his office who felt like they were in possession of the firearm that was used in the murder of Avis Banks.
That afternoon, the lawyer and his client are sitting at the Ridgeland Police Department, and they've brought with them an empty .38 caliber revolver.
We knew at that point that the projectiles removed from the body, from Avis's body, were definitely .38s.
But the caliber of the weapon isn't all that piques detectives' interest.
The gentleman who had the gun indicated that he was a family member of Carla Hughes.
The man's name is Patrick Nash. Patrick is Carla's cousin, and he tells detectives that 3 days before Avis's murder, Carla showed up at his house with an unusual request.
Well, my cousin Carla, she came over and borrowed a gun and a knife for protection.
Carla had told Patrick that there had been a recent string of break-ins in her neighborhood that she feared for her safety.
He loaned her a gun and a knife.
Patrick tells detectives that a couple of days after the murder, Carla returned the gun, minus 5 rounds of ammo.
She said she had been used those bullets in target practicing. The knife was never returned.
According to Patrick, Carla was asked, hey, if we take this gun to the police, are they gonna link it back to that murder in Ridgeland? And Carla didn't answer, she just kind of hung her head.
Carla's cousin has provided investigators with the break they've been looking for. They thank Patrick Nash for his help, collect his gun, and send it to their ballistics lab for testing. 48 hours later, they have their results.
That was, in fact, the weapon that was used to shoot and kill Avis Banks.
That afternoon, Ridgeland police issue a warrant for the arrest of Carla Hughes.
Carla, through her attorney, learned that we had an arrest warrant for her. She arrived at the police department. She was taken into custody.
With Carla in custody, police pepper her with questions. They start by asking her where she was the night Avis Banks was murdered.
Her alibi is that she's home for several hours and goes to a local track in which she jogs, then returns home.
Police aren't buying it. But in order to press charges against Carla, they need evidence that definitively places her at the crime scene. Searching in Carla's bedroom, Lieutenant Neal and his men come across a nightstand filled with personal keepsakes.
This was where Carla kept all of her stuff that would be private to her.
Among the items in the drawer is a photo of Keon along with a poem entitled, I Discovered.
The language in the poem was such that I've longed for you all my life. I've been waiting for somebody like you, our life together, stuff that would have made the recipient of it think I'm in a relationship with this person.
At the bottom of the poem are the initials KP.
We assumed was Keon Pittman.
While the poem and the picture are further proof of Keon and Carla's affair, they don't tie Carla to the murder in a concrete fashion. But when they search Carla's bedroom closet, Lieutenant Neal's team finds a far more compelling piece of evidence.
We were able to locate a shoebox that contained a pair of black rubber sole tread-safe shoes.
The tread pattern appears to be a match for the shoe print the killer left on Avis and Keon's back door. The shoes are sent to the crime lab for analysis. As he waits for results, Lieutenant Neal pulls Carla's cell phone records.
We were able to go back, get poll records with who she was calling, and not only that, but where she was when she was placing these phone calls.
Lieutenant Neal determines that Carla and her phone were in the vicinity of Keon and Avis's house just moments before the crime occurred.
At the time that Avis would have been arriving at home, Carla's records put her in that vicinity at the Banks residence.
But the cell phone records aren't the only thing that places Carla near the crime scene. CSIs determined that the tread on the shoes found in Carla's closet is the exact match for the shoe print found on Avis and Keon's back door.
We have the cell phone records, of course. We have the gun. We have the shoes. We have motive.
On Friday, December 8th, 2006, District Attorney Michael Guest formally charges Carla Hughes with murder.
She was charged with 2 counts of capital murder for the death of Avis Banks and the death of the unborn child of Avis Banks.
Her being one of Keon's mistresses was a very big shock.
The following morning, news of the indictment is splashed across the front page of the local paper. Seeing a beloved middle school teacher charged with capital murder sends shockwaves through the Ridgeland community.
She was like the all-American church-going young lady, sorority girl.
I didn't understand how Carla could do that to her.
We were just shocked. You couldn't think. You couldn't do anything except, just pray.
I think it's hard for them to accept that she would have any part in a murder.
But as prosecutors prepare their case against Carla, detectives turn their attention back to Keon Pittman and a question that's been gnawing at them since his initial interview. Is Keon Pittman truly innocent of his fiance's murder, or is he the crime's mastermind? Ridgeland, Mississippi is known for its quiet streets and cozy small-town feel. It's where Avis Banks planned to spend the rest of her life with her handsome husband-to-be, Keon Pittman. But in 2006, the murder of this beautiful, expectant mother has rocked this suburb of Ridgeland to its core.
I was really shocked just to hear this murder in Ridgeland because it just was so unexpected in this area.
It makes you feel sick when you hear that a woman who was 5 months pregnant is murdered.
Even more unexpected is the identity of the woman accused of the crime. Beautiful young school teacher Carla Hughes, who detectives have discovered was carrying on an affair with Avis Banks' fiancé, fellow school teacher Keon Pittman.
I'm thinking, what in the world has gone on here? You have a young woman whose life is on track, and all of a sudden, you bottom out.
I think Carla snapped. I think she was jealous. I think she fell head over heels for this guy, so much so that she went crazy.
You told me you love me, though. Don't try to make me the bad guy.
What detectives haven't figured out is whether or not Keon Pittman conspired with Carla to carry out the attack on his fiancée.
But we still feel like he may have been involved with this and knows something.
It's under this dark cloud of uncertainty that the state of Mississippi versus Carla Hughes for the murder of Avis Banks and her unborn child begins. In his opening statement, prosecutor Michael Guest lays out their version of how the crime unfolded.
This defendant had the motive and the means and the opportunity to commit this crime.
According to Guest, it starts at 5:40 p.m. Carla parks her car 100 yards away from Keon and Avis's house. Armed with her cousin's hunting knife and his .38 Special, Carla then sneaks to the back of the residence.
She gained entry into the house by, kicking on a back door.
She staged the house to look like someone had ransacked it and tried to come in and burglarize the home.
Once Carla had set the scene to look like a robbery, she positions herself just inside the door to the garage.
She laid in wait outside that entrance door into the garage until she knew that Avis was getting out of her car.
That's when Carla started firing the gun.
Carla shoots Avis 4 times. Then Carla takes a knife to her victim.
After Avis was dead, she stabbed her and slashed her neck.
Her being a female and doing that to another female was a very big shock.
After laying out their theory about how the crime unfolded, the state introduces the evidence they've collected against Carla: the murder weapon, the shoe print, and the cell phone records that place her at the crime scene.
We have a significant amount of circumstantial evidence showing that Carla Hughes committed this crime.
As for motive, prosecutor Guest claims that's pretty straightforward. Carla thought she, not Avis, was the one who deserved to be with Keon forever.
Carla Hughes wanted what Avis Banks had, and that was Keon Pittman.
Next, it's the defense's turn, and in their opening statement, Carla's attorney, Johnny Walls, makes a shocking assertion.
The whole defense strategy is that Keon Pittman murdered Avis Banks and framed Carla.
To support their claim, the defense points out that Keon had shoes with a similar tread to Carla, and that in the days leading up to the murder, he had encouraged Carla to obtain a handgun.
He was the one that had suggested that she might need to have a gun or something. He knew about her shoes. He was just in a position to frame her.
As for Keon's possible motive, the defense claims Keon wanted Avis gone so he could maintain his playboy lifestyle.
Although he would have lost a lot by Avis being murdered, he would also have gained a lot by Avis not being around anymore.
As for Keon's alibi that he was coaching basketball practice at the time of the murder, Carla's defense asserts that there was a 30-minute period where his assistant coach ran practice for him.
Keon had an opportunity to leave basketball practice. He had time to commit the crime.
It's an argument that makes for high courtroom drama. But is it enough to get Carla off the hook? Before the jury can answer that question, prosecutors call a surprise witness. A man whose testimony will change the entire dynamic of the case. A man named Keon Pittman. trial against Carla Hughes for the murder of expectant mother Avis Banks has been nothing short of riveting. The prosecutor began by laying out a mountain of evidence linking Carla to the crime. But the defense countered that Keon Pittman was the killer and that he framed Carla for the crime, which leaves prosecutor Michael Guest with only one option. On October 6, 2009, he calls Keon to the stand to tell his version of the truth.
We're worried because we know that the defense is going to make him out to be the murderer. But we also know he's the only person that can set the entire scene for the jury.
But no sooner had he taken the stand than Keon breaks down. Or at least tries to.
He's trying to cry. He's not really crying.
The first thing that went through my mind was no tears are falling from your eyes at all.
Keon's tears may seem like bad acting to some, but the story of his affair with Carla Hughes plays like a red-hot romance novel.
What did you think was going on? What did you think was happening?
A sexual adventure.
According to Keon, the affair was hot and heavy from the get-go, but soon Carla wanted more from him than just sex.
She started asking me about Avis and, I guess, me leaving her and different things. And I maintained that would never happen. I would never leave her.
According to Keon, when Carla realized he wasn't going to leave Avis, she became obsessed with him, texting and calling him repeatedly. Carla even faked being pregnant in order to get him to pay attention to her. Keon didn't take the bait.
He tells her, if you come to my house, I'm calling the police.
2 weeks later, Avis is dead. Keon's testimony is powerful, but Carla's defense counters with a withering cross-examination.
I was hoping that he would implicate himself.
Was there anything that stopped you from standing at that door and waiting for her to come in?
There's nothing to stop me, but that's not what I didn't do.
And you did that, didn't you?
No, I did not. No, I did not.
Throughout the testimony, Keon, continued to maintain that he did not kill Avis.
With Keon's riveting turn on the stand complete, both sides rest. But whose story will the jury believe? Keon's or Carla's? Just 8 hours later, they return with their verdict.
Everyone goes back in the courtroom. The jury walks in, and several of them had been crying.
None of us really know what way the jury's leaning.
We, the jury, find the defendant, Carla Hughes, guilty of capital murder as charged.
Avis's family is overjoyed by the verdict.
The only thing I could think of was, thank God.
When the verdict came back and they said Carla was guilty, God is good.
Be sentenced to a term of life imprisonment without parole in the custody of the Mississippi Department of Corrections.
She will live the rest of her natural life in custody, and so it is a death sentence in a way.
As Carla is escorted out of the courtroom and off to prison, she grows increasingly hysterical. Although it's clear her obsession with Keon Pittman led to the murder of Avis Banks, Avis's family, like so many others familiar with the case, isn't sure justice has been completely served.
Keon Pittman is a liar and a betrayer.
He didn't want to have to be tied down and be a husband and be a father and stay in the home with his family. He wanted to be out and be free to be with whoever he wanted to be with. I think most people believe he got away with murder.
There's absolutely no doubt in our mind that Keon Pittman needs to pay a price for something in this crime.
Either way, those closest to the case can't help but wonder, what would have become of Avis Banks, the gentle soul, the beloved teacher, the mother-to-be, had she not been collateral damage in Keon and Carla's torrid, some might say, fatal attraction.
The concept of a monster is something society usually reserves for the shadows, for the dark alleys, for the strangers lurking at the edge of town. We are conditioned from a very young age to fear the unknown, to avoid the unfamiliar face, and to never stray from the well-lit path. But the most terrifying reality of human nature is that true darkness rarely announces itself with a warning. It does not hide in the shadows. Instead, it operates in the broad daylight, wrapping itself in the comforting, mundane fabric of everyday life. It wears a gentle smile, it speaks with a soft, calming voice, and it embeds itself deep within the heart of a trusting community. This is a story about the complete and utter betrayal of innocence. It is a story about how a neighborhood's sense of security was weaponized against its most vulnerable residents, turning a place of childhood joy into an epicenter of unimaginable horror. To understand the gravity of the Houston mass murders, one must first look past the grotesque end of the story and examine the quiet, unassuming beginning, rooted in the sweltering heat of Texas in the early 1970s. Between the years of 1970 and 1973, the Houston Heights neighborhood was a place where working-class families lived simple lives, where children roamed the streets freely until the streetlights came on, and where neighbors knew each other by name. It was a community built on a foundation of implicit trust. At the center of this trust was a man named Dean Arnold Corll. Born in 1939, Corll was the absolute antithesis of what anyone would consider a threat. He was known throughout the area as a mild-mannered, quiet, and deeply private individual. He did not draw attention to himself through loud behavior or erratic actions. Instead, he presented the perfect image of a stable, harmless local businessman. His family owned and operated the Corll Candy Company, a local establishment that brought a literal sense of sweetness to the neighborhood. For a child growing up in the Heights, the presence of a local candy factory was something out of a dream, and Dean Corll positioned himself as the benevolent figure at the center of it all. He was a familiar face, a man who consistently went out of his way to offer free candy to the local children. He was generous, he was approachable, and he was universally liked. The children adored him for his unending supply of sweets, and the parents respected him as a kind-hearted local merchant who looked out for the youth. They affectionately bestowed upon him the moniker of the Candy Man. It was an innocent nickname, a term of endearment that reflected the warmth and generosity he seemingly exuded. No parent ever thought twice about their son spending time around the quiet man who handed out treats. He was a fixture of their environment, as normal and unquestioned as the Texas sun. But beneath this carefully constructed facade of benevolence, behind the quiet demeanor and the sweet offerings, Dean Corll was meticulously laying the groundwork for a campaign of terror that would forever scar the city of Houston. The transition from a trusted community figure to a prolific predator did not happen in a vacuum. It required a specific environment, a specific demographic, and a highly calculated method of operation. The early 1970s were a time of shifting cultural landscapes, but in neighborhoods like the Heights, the innocence of youth still prevailed. Teenage boys, ranging in age from 13 to 20, were beginning to experience the desire for independence. They were old enough to venture away from home, to hang out with friends, to look for part-time work, and to seek out new experiences. It is this exact transitional phase of life, the space between childhood and adulthood, that Dean Corll identified as his hunting ground. He recognized that boys of this age were trusting, easily influenced by peer pressure, and susceptible to the allure of a good time. However, Corll also understood that despite his friendly reputation, a grown man approaching young teenagers might eventually raise suspicion. He needed a buffer. He needed a way to bypass the natural defenses of his victims and ensure a steady supply of prey without drawing any attention to his own doorstep. The solution to this logistical problem elevated Corll's crimes from the actions of a lone predator to a highly organized, systematic hunting operation. He realized that the most effective way to lure a teenage boy into a trap was not to approach them himself, but to have the invitation come from a trusted peer. To execute this, Corll recruited 2 local youths to serve as his accomplices, his human bait. These were not hardened criminals or mysterious outsiders. They were neighborhood boys, faces that blended seamlessly into the local social fabric. Elmer Wayne Henley, who would be 17 years old at the time of his eventual arrest, and David Brooks, who would be 18, were the chosen instruments of Corll's malice. Henley and Brooks were young, impressionable, and easily manipulated. Corll, possessing both the financial means from his business endeavors and a deep understanding of human weakness, recognized exactly how to control them. He did not use brute force to secure their loyalty. Instead, he used a potent combination of bribery, psychological manipulation, and the promise of a lifestyle that was otherwise unattainable for teenagers in their position. Coral began by integrating the two boys into his private life, providing them with access to alcohol, marijuana, and a space where the rules of the outside world did not apply. He made them feel special, providing them with the use of vehicles and showering them with a level of attention and material wealth that effectively blinded them to the reality of what they were becoming involved in. Once he had secured their absolute compliance, Coral introduced the financial incentive that would seal the fate of dozens of young men. He established a bounty system, a cold and calculated transaction that placed a monetary value on human life. For every young boy that Henley and Brooks could successfully lure back to Coral's residence, or to the various rented apartments and boat sheds he maintained, he promised to pay them a staggering sum. The bounty ranged from $200 to $500 per victim. In the economic climate of the early 1970s, this was an astronomical amount of money, especially for teenagers with no other means of income. The sheer volume of cash offered was enough to override whatever moral compass Henley and Brooks might have possessed, transforming them from local teenagers into active, willing participants in a monstrous enterprise. The methodology they employed was devastatingly simple and profoundly cruel because it weaponized the very concept of friendship. The victims were not snatched off the street by a stranger in a passing vehicle. They were not dragged kicking and screaming into the night. Instead, they were approached by someone they knew, someone they trusted. The majority of the young men who fell into Coral's trap were classmates, acquaintances, or runaway youths that Henley and Brooks had befriended in the neighborhood. The approach was always casual, framed as a harmless invitation. Henley or Brooks would spot a familiar face walking down the street, hanging out at a local park, or looking for something to do, and they would strike up a conversation. The lure was perfectly tailored to the desires of teenage boys. The accomplices would offer an invitation to a party, a promise of free alcohol, the prospect of doing drugs away from the prying eyes of parents, the chance to ride around in a nice car, or simply the opportunity to hang out in a place where they would be treated like adults. It was an offer that, to a bored or curious teenager, seemed entirely harmless and highly appealing. Because the invitation came from a peer, from a boy their own age who they had seen around school or the neighborhood, there was absolutely no reason to suspect danger. The victims willingly got into the cars. They willingly walked through the front doors, completely unaware that they were crossing a threshold from which they would never return. This dynamic of betrayal is perhaps the most chilling aspect of the entire operation. Dean Coral managed to insulate himself completely by outsourcing the initial capture to the victim's own peers. When a boy disappeared, there were no signs of a struggle, no witnesses to an abduction, and no immediate reason for the community to panic. The boys simply vanished, seemingly of their own volition. The community, blinded by their trust in the Candy Man and their familiarity with Henley and Brooks, failed to see the predator operating in plain sight. They failed to realize that the friendly neighborhood was being systematically purged of its youth, one quiet, polite invitation at a time. The trap was set with terrifying efficiency, relying entirely on the victims' misplaced trust in their friends and the community's collective inability to imagine that a monster was living right next door, smiling at their children and handing out sweets. The stage was meticulously prepared for the horrors that would unfold behind closed doors. A nightmare engineered by a quiet man who understood that the easiest way to destroy a life was to simply ask it to come inside. To truly comprehend the magnitude of the tragedy that unfolded in Houston during the early 1970s, one must look beyond the monstrous figure of the perpetrator and focus deeply on the victims and the environment that allowed their disappearances to go unnoticed. The backdrop of these crimes is just as crucial as the crimes themselves, for it provides the devastating context of how a predator was able to operate with absolute impunity in plain sight. The city of Houston during this era was a place of rapid expansion, a sprawling metropolis defined by its sweltering humidity, endless stretches of concrete, and a booming economy. However, nestled within this massive urban sprawl were tight-knit, working-class enclaves like the Heights neighborhood. This was a community where the American dream was pursued through hard work, where parents labored long hours in factories or local businesses to provide for their families, and where the neighborhood streets were the primary playground for the local youth. Life for a teenager in this specific time and place was characterized by an unparalleled sense of physical freedom. Long before the advent of mobile phones, digital tracking, or the constant connectivity of the modern age, adolescent life was lived outdoors and out of sight. A bicycle was not just a toy. It was a vessel of absolute independence. Boys between the ages of 13 and 20 would leave their homes in the morning and were not expected back until the dinner bell rang or the streetlights flickered on against the Texas dusk. They spent their days riding through the neighborhoods, looking for part-time summer jobs, hanging out at local diners, exploring nearby wooded areas, or simply seeking refuge from the oppressive heat in air-conditioned movie theaters and bowling alleys. They were at an awkward, beautiful stage of life, navigating the turbulent transition between childhood dependence and adult responsibility. They were seeking autonomy, trying to assert their identities, and constantly looking for spaces where they could socialize away from the watchful eyes of their parents. It was precisely this natural, healthy desire for independence that rendered these boys incredibly vulnerable. The victims of this silent massacre were not hardened runaways fleeing abusive homes, nor were they heavily involved in dangerous criminal underworlds. They were ordinary boys. They were sons, brothers, classmates, and friends. They were the boys who bagged groceries at the local market, the boys who played baseball in the dusty sandlots, the boys who were saving up for their first cars. They were inherently trusting because they had grown up in an environment where neighbors looked out for one another. Their worldview was shaped by a community that, despite its economic struggles, maintained a fundamental belief in the goodness of familiar faces. When they were approached by youths their own age, individuals they recognized from the school hallways or the local parks, their natural defenses were entirely dormant. They possessed the typical teenage belief in their own invincibility, completely incapable of imagining that the familiar streets they had navigated their entire lives could suddenly open up and swallow them whole. The true horror of the situation was compounded by a catastrophic systemic failure that provided the perfect camouflage for a serial predator. The early 1970s were a period of immense cultural upheaval across the United States. The counterculture movement had normalized the concept of youth rebellion, and a nationwide epidemic of teenage runaways was dominating the headlines. Young people across the country were hitchhiking across state lines, joining communes, and leaving their hometowns in search of a different way of life. Consequently, law enforcement agencies, including the Houston Police Department, were overwhelmed with missing persons reports. They had developed a cynical, bureaucratic reflex when it came to missing teenagers. When a teenage boy vanished without a trace, the immediate institutional assumption was that he had simply chosen to leave. This assumption became a secondary trauma for the families of the victims. When the parents of these missing boys realized that their sons had not returned home for dinner, that their beds were unslept in, and that their bicycles were nowhere to be found, they experienced a primal, soul-crushing panic. They rushed to the local police precincts, desperate for assistance, only to be met with institutional apathy. Detectives and desk sergeants listened passively to the frantic pleas of mothers and fathers, taking down basic descriptions but offering little in the way of actual investigation. The parents were repeatedly told that their sons were at the prime age for running away, that boys often left home to seek adventure or escape parental rules, and that they would likely return when they ran out of money or got hungry. The police effectively categorized these disappearances as voluntary absences rather than potential crimes, resulting in an absolute failure to launch coordinated search efforts, interview witnesses, or connect the dots between the growing number of missing youths from the exact same neighborhood. The agonizing isolation felt by these families is difficult to overstate. Abandoned by the very authorities sworn to protect them, the parents were left to conduct their own desperate investigations. They formed informal networks of grief, driving slowly through the streets of Houston late into the night, shining flashlights down dark alleys and peering into abandoned buildings. They spent their meager savings printing thousands of flyers bearing the smiling school portraits of their lost sons, stapling them to telephone poles, community bulletin boards, and storefront windows. These faded, weather-beaten pieces of paper became a tragic fixture of the neighborhood, a silent chorus of unanswered questions fluttering in the warm Gulf breeze. The parents questioned their sons' friends, they tracked down rumors, and they waited agonizingly by the telephone, praying for a ransom demand or a simple phone call confirming their child was still alive. They lived in a suspended state of torment, trapped between the agonizing hope of a safe return and the creeping, unspeakable dread that something terrible had happened. What the families and the police failed to realize was that the neighborhood was bleeding from the inside out. The predator was not a stranger snatching boys from the roadside and fleeing into the night. The threat was deeply embedded in the community's own social fabric. The use of teenage accomplices created an insidious web of betrayal that exploited the very bonds of friendship these boys cherished. Because the victims were all drawn from the same general area and social circles, a horrific ripple effect began to take place. As boys began to vanish, their friends naturally grew concerned. They talked among themselves, wondering where their classmates had gone. It was in this atmosphere of confusion and worry that the trap became even more perverse. In several tragic instances, the accomplices utilized the disappearances themselves as a lure. They would approach a boy who was actively searching for his missing friend or brother. Feigning concern and possessing the ultimate inside knowledge, the accomplices would offer false information. They would claim to have seen the missing boy, or suggest that they knew where he was hiding out. They would promise to take the searching youth to his friend, offering a ride or a walk to a specific location. The victim, driven by loyalty and the desperate desire to reunite with his missing companion, would follow without hesitation. In their attempt to rescue a lost friend, they willingly walked directly into the same abyss. The community was unknowingly cannibalizing its own youth, with the trust inherent in teenage friendships serving as the primary weapon of destruction. This cycle of disappearance and deception thrived on the absolute normalcy of the environment. The locations where the horrors would eventually take place were not isolated, terrifying fortresses. They were ordinary residential homes, rented apartments, and unassuming boat sheds. They sat on regular streets, surrounded by neighbors who mowed their lawns, walked their dogs, and lived their mundane lives completely oblivious to the darkness residing just a few yards away. When a victim was lured to one of these locations, there was no outward sign of danger. The sun was still shining, the neighborhood birds were still singing, and the house looked exactly like every other house on the block. The victims approached these physical thresholds with completely relaxed postures. They were expecting a party, a few beers, or perhaps a conversation about a missing friend. They walked up driveways, climbed front steps, and casually crossed the threshold into the living spaces of a man who was already anticipating their arrival. They heard the front door close behind them, the click of the lock sounding no different than it would in their own homes. The air inside might have smelled of stale cigarette smoke or perhaps the faint, metallic tang of tools, but nothing immediately triggered their survival instincts. They were offered a seat, they were offered a drink, and for a few fleeting moments, the illusion of safety was maintained. They did not know that the quiet, mild-mannered man greeting them was the architect of their impending doom. They did not know that the drink they were handed was laced with sedatives designed to strip away their physical autonomy. And they certainly did not know about the specialized piece of furniture, built with grim precision, waiting for them in a back room. They stood in the living room, surrounded by the ordinary trappings of a mid-century Texas home, entirely unaware that the world as they knew it had just violently contracted to the square footage of that house. The environment they trusted, the friends they followed, and the society that promised to protect them had all collectively failed, delivering them seamlessly into the hands of a waiting nightmare. The grim discovery of the 21 bodies buried beneath the dirt floor of the Southwest Houston boat shed was only the terrifying prologue to an exhaustive statewide excavation that would forever change the landscape of criminal investigations in Texas. As investigators processed the sheer volume of human remains recovered from the initial site, Elmer Wayne Henley and David Brooks provided law enforcement with the coordinates for the remaining burial grounds, directing the authorities toward the desolate, wind-swept coastal dunes of High Island on the Bolivar Peninsula and the dense, unforgiving wilderness of the San Jacinto County woods. At High Island, forensic teams worked under the blazing sun, sifting through the shifting sands where the rhythmic crashing of the Gulf waves had spent years concealing the tragic results of the Candyman's operations. The remote beaches, chosen by Dean Coral for their illusion of eternal secrecy, yielded additional plastic-wrapped bundles, each one containing the broken body of a young man whose family had spent years searching in vain. Simultaneously, deep in the thick pine forests of San Jacinto County. Search parties combed through the dense underbrush and tangled root systems, guided by the precise memory of teenagers who had participated in nightmares they could no longer outrun. The recovery effort in the woods was grueling and emotionally shattering, requiring investigators to carefully unearth skeletal remains that had been swallowed by the Texas wilderness, protected only by layers of powdered lime and heavy-duty plastic. When the final tally was officially calculated and corroborated by forensic anthropologists and dental records, the horrific scope of the massacre was laid bare for the public to witness, confirming that at least 28 young men and boys had been systematically hunted, tortured, and murdered over a period of 3 agonizing years. The sheer magnitude of the casualty counts stunned the nation, making it the most prolific serial murder case in American history up to that point and shattering any lingering illusions that small, working-class neighborhoods were immune to profound, calculated evil. With the mass graves fully excavated and the primary perpetrator dead by a bullet from his own accomplice, the full weight of the judicial system shifted toward the remaining living participants of the terror network, beginning with the immediate apprehension of David Brooks. Following Henley's initial confession at the police station, detectives wasted no time locating 18-year-old David Brooks, who had managed to evade the immediate chaos at Coral's house on the morning of August 8th. When officers tracked Brooks down and brought him in for questioning, he initially maintained a facade of defensive ignorance, attempting to distance himself from the horrific realities unfolding across the city. However, the facade quickly collapsed when faced with the incontrovertible weight of physical evidence, the recovery sites he had helped establish, and the detailed, unsparing testimony provided by his co-conspirator Elmer Wayne Henley. Brooks realized that his desperate attempts to deny involvement were completely futile against the mountain of evidence proving his active participation in the recruitment, luring, and subsequent murder of the victims. Confronted with the absolute breakdown of his defenses, Brooks ultimately cracked, offering his own comprehensive statements to detectives that further illuminated the chilling mechanics of how Coral had manipulated and controlled them through money, drugs, and psychological dominance. The confessions of both teenagers provided prosecutors with an airtight case, transforming what could have been a confusing web of shifting blame into a clear, devastating narrative of premeditated, multi-person serial murder that shocked the collective conscience of the judicial system and set the stage for one of the most solemn and emotionally charged legal reckonings in the history of the state. The formal legal proceedings and subsequent trials took place against a backdrop of intense public outrage, profound grief, and relentless media scrutiny that enveloped the city of Houston and echoed across the entire country. The families of the 28 victims, having lived through the agonizing uncertainty of missing children followed by the catastrophic trauma of identifying their remains from dental charts and personal effects, packed the courtrooms every single day, seeking a measure of accountability that no legal verdict could ever truly satisfy. The courtroom atmosphere was thick with palpable tension and sorrow, as prosecutors prepared to present a case unlike anything the Texas legal system had ever encountered. The defense attorneys for both Elmer Wayne Henley and David Brooks faced an almost insurmountable challenge, as they attempted to navigate the complex legal boundaries of youthful culpability, severe psychological manipulation, and the overwhelming nature of the physical and testimonial evidence. They argued that their clients were themselves victims of an older, highly predatory mastermind who had exploited their adolescent vulnerabilities, drug habits, and lack of maturity to turn them into reluctant or brainwashed instruments of his own murderous desires. Yet, the prosecution countered these arguments with relentless factual rigor, detailing how both Henley and Brooks had willingly crossed the line from manipulated youths to active financial beneficiaries and willing executioners, enthusiastically collecting hundreds of dollars in blood money for every human life they delivered to the slaughterhouse. The trials forced the jury members to listen to hours of harrowing testimony regarding the specialized wooden torture boards, the chemical preservation methods, and the systematic destruction of human dignity that had occurred behind closed residential doors, transforming the courtroom into a solemn sanctuary for the victims whose voices had been permanently silenced. The judicial outcome for Elmer Wayne Henley was determined after a rigorous legal process that weighed his cooperation with the police against the sheer brutality of his crimes. Despite pulling the trigger that ended Coral's life and subsequently breaking the case wide open through his confession, Henley could not escape the severe legal consequences of his extensive participation in the 3-year massacre. When his case reached its formal conclusion, the court delivered a definitive verdict, sentencing Elmer Wayne Henley to 99 years in prison for his proven role in 6 specific counts of murder. The sentence, while representing the maximum legal penalty available at the time for his designated convictions, felt to many grieving family members like an insufficient accounting for the dozens of lives he had helped extinguish. Yet it marked the official closure of the primary trial phase and ensured that the teenage accomplice would spend the remainder of his formative years and adult life behind impenetrable prison walls. Simultaneously, the legal fate of David Brooks was sealed as prosecutors secured a formal conviction based on his extensive involvement in the conspiracy and execution of the victims. Brooks, who had served alongside Henley as one of Coral's primary recruiters and secondary participants in the horrific abuse, faced the full force of the law for his betrayal of his peers. The court formally sentenced David Brooks to 99 years in prison for his direct charge of participating in the murder of the victims. This sentence officially codified his role as an active architect of the tragedy, rejecting any notion that he was merely an innocent bystander who had stumbled into a nightmare. With both accomplices formally sentenced to nearly a century behind bars, the formal legal trials came to a close. But the psychological and institutional reverberations of the Houston mass murders continued to ripple outward, leaving an indelible scar on the community and forever altering how law enforcement agencies across the nation responded to reports of missing teenagers. The transition from the courtroom to the penal system marked the beginning of a long, unchanging chapter of isolation and infamy for both Henley and Brooks as they entered the maximum security facilities of the Texas Department of Corrections. Stripped of the fleeting wealth, the illusion of power, and the destructive camaraderie that had defined their teenage years, they were thrust into a harsh, highly regulated environment where their names became synonymous with some of the most grotesque crimes in American history. Within the concrete and steel confines of the prison system, they lived as pariahs, universally reviled by both inmates and correctional staff due to the uniquely disturbing nature of their offenses against young boys. Despite the immense passage of time and the physical aging process that transformed the reckless teenagers into weathered middle-aged and elderly men, their daily existence remained starkly monotonous, punctuated only by the rigid schedules of incarceration and the persistent shadow of their past actions. They attempted to adapt to the grueling realities of long-term imprisonment, but the absolute permanence of their 99-year sentences meant that every single day offered the exact same horizon of confinement, a continuous, unrelenting reminder of the 28 lives they had cut short in the humid summers of early 70s Houston. Even as decades passed and generations shifted outside the prison walls, the ghosts of the Dean Coral case refused to fade into quiet obscurity, regularly rearing their heads whenever Henley or Brooks became eligible for periodic parole reviews. Under the legal framework of the Texas penal system, both inmates were granted mandatory periodic opportunities to stand before the parole board and argue for their release back into society, a procedural requirement that consistently reopened deep, agonizing emotional wounds for the surviving family members of the victims. Every few years, as a parole hearing approached, mothers, fathers, siblings, and friends of the 28 young men mobilized with fierce determination, organizing letter-writing campaigns, petitioning public officials, and traveling across the state to personally appear before the board and deliver heart-wrenching testimonies. They recounted the unbearable pain of losing a child, described the empty chairs at family holiday tables, and passionately argued that granting freedom to men who had casually traded human lives for cash would be a catastrophic miscarriage of justice that insulted the memory of the dead. The Texas Board of Pardons and Paroles unfailingly listened to these powerful appeals, and faced with the staggering brutality of the original crimes and the overwhelming public outrage, they repeatedly and unequivocally denied every single request for parole submitted by both Henley and Brooks. These successive rejections served as a powerful, recurring affirmation that the severity of their actions had permanently forfeited their right to walk free among the society they had so profoundly violated, ensuring that the legal boundaries established in the 1970s remained strong and unyielding against the passage of time. The final chapter of accountability within this dark historical narrative reached its definitive conclusion in the year 2020, when aging and infirmity finally caught up with one of the perpetrators inside the prison system. David Brooks, who had spent nearly 5 decades behind bars reflecting on the horrors of his youth and the consequences of his complete moral collapse, passed away while incarcerated in the custody of the Texas Department of Corrections. His death was officially attributed to cancer, bringing a quiet, unheralded end to the life of one of the 2 primary accomplices who had helped facilitate the Houston mass murders. There were no grand public celebrations, no widespread media spectacles, and no profound cultural reckonings over his passing. Instead, his death occurred quietly within the sterile environment of a prison medical facility, marking the literal fading away of a man who had chosen to align himself with pure darkness. With Brooks's death, only Elmer Wayne Henley remained alive within the penal system, continuing to serve his remaining decades behind bars, a living relic of a tragedy that had forever transformed the city of Houston and left a permanent, sorrowful mark on the collective memory of the American criminal justice landscape. The exposure of the Houston mass murders sent an irreversible shockwave through the cultural and social consciousness of the United States, permanently dismantling long-held illusions about safety, community protection, and the true nature of human evil. For generations, American society had cultivated a comforting myth that physical danger always lurked in the dark exterior of civilization, waiting silently in abandoned alleys, unlit highway rest stops, or behind the menacing faces of strangers who stood out conspicuously from the crowd. Parents systematically taught their children to fear the outsider, the drifter, the transient individual who did not belong to the familiar fabric of the local working-class neighborhood. But the horrific, multi-year legacy of Dean Corll shattered this protective illusion with brutal finality, forcing a painful, collective awakening to the terrifying reality that the most lethal and destructive predators do not wear outward disguises of malice, nor do they operate exclusively on the dark fringes of society. Instead, they wear the comforting mask of absolute normalcy, embedding themselves deeply within the trusted institutions of daily life, smiling benignly from behind local counters, handing out sweet treats to neighborhood children, and participating seamlessly in the mundane rhythms of American communities. The Candyman was not an aggressive intruder who broke down doors in the dead of night to snatch his victims from their beds. He was a recognized local figure, a quiet neighbor, a benign fixture whose very accessibility and apparent generosity were systematically weaponized against the most vulnerable and trusting members of the population. This devastating realization stripped away the psychological armor of countless communities across the entire country, replacing a warm sense of collective trust with an underlying, permanent vigilance that fundamentally altered how neighbors viewed one another and how parents approached the complex challenge of protecting their children. The systemic institutional failures that permitted this multi-year slaughter to persist unchecked exposed deep, structural flaws within law enforcement agencies, municipal governments, and child welfare systems during the early 1970s. In an era dominated by profound cultural shifts, an unprecedented nationwide epidemic of teenage runaways, and a cynical bureaucratic reflex toward missing youths, the Houston Police Department and surrounding authorities had developed a dangerously casual, dismissive attitude toward disappearing adolescents. When young boys vanished from their homes without a trace, the institutional response was characterized by absolute apathy and administrative negligence, writing off the tragedies as voluntary departures or rebellious teenage phases rather than investigating them with the urgency required for potential criminal acts. This systemic indifference left families entirely abandoned to their own desperate devices, forcing grieving mothers and fathers to comb the dark streets alone late into the night, while a prolific serial killer operated with absolute impunity just blocks away. The eventual exposure of the mass graves served as a catastrophic wake-up call for the American criminal justice system, forcing a radical, long-overdue reevaluation of how missing persons reports involving teenagers and young adults were prioritized, coordinated, and investigated. Law enforcement agencies across the nation were forced to confront the grim administrative reality that bureaucratic assumptions could be lethally dangerous, leading directly to sweeping reforms in interagency data sharing, cross-jurisdictional cooperation, and the institutional handling of missing youth cases. No longer could a police department casually dismiss a missing teenager as a simple runaway without conducting rigorous, proactive investigations, because the haunting shadow of the Houston mass murders stood as a permanent, sorrowful monument to what happens when authorities fail to look beneath the surface of a seemingly benign disappearance. Beyond the institutional reckonings and legal ramifications, the human cost of the tragedy remained an open, bleeding wound that the passage of time could never fully heal, etching an indelible sorrow into the collective memory of the grieving families and the city of Houston. The 28 young men whose lives were so violently and prematurely cut short were never merely statistics in a grim criminal archive. They were sons, brothers, classmates, and friends possessing unwritten futures, vibrant personalities, and deep bonds of familial love that were senselessly snuffed out by greed, cruelty, and absolute moral emptiness. Their families endured a lifetime of compounded trauma, navigating the agonizing limbo of missing children only to be confronted with the devastating finality of plastic-wrapped remains, chemical preservation, and dental charts. The major holidays, family milestones, and everyday moments of ordinary life were forever overshadowed by empty chairs at dinner tables and the haunting, unanswerable question of what those young lives could have become had they not crossed paths with a monster disguised as a supportive friend. The survival of witnesses and accomplices like Elmer Wayne Henley, living out their remaining decades behind the impenetrable concrete walls of maximum security confinement, offered little true solace to those who mourned, because no legal verdict, courtroom drama, or prison sentence could ever resurrect the dead or restore the profound innocence of a community that had been brutally betrayed from within. The psychological landscape of the Heights and the surrounding neighborhoods was permanently fractured, transforming once carefree streets into silent monuments of a shared national nightmare. The broader cultural legacy of the Dean Corll case extends far beyond the historical boundaries of 1973 Texas, establishing a dark, foundational template for how modern society understands, analyzes, and combats serial predation. Criminologists, forensic psychologists, and true crime historians have studied the intricate dynamics of the Houston mass murders for decades, analyzing with clinical detachment how a single individual could successfully manipulate teenage accomplices through a toxic, calculated cocktail of financial incentives, psychological dominance, and controlled substance abuse to build an efficient, decentralized killing machine. The use of human bait, the systematic outsourcing of abduction to trusted peers whom the victims already knew, and the chilling normalization of extreme atrocities within a domestic setting revealed a complex web of deviance that directly challenged traditional profiles of lone, isolated serial killers operating in secret. Corll did not operate in a dark, secluded cabin tucked away in the wilderness. He operated in ordinary houses on ordinary residential streets, demonstrating with terrifying clarity how easily the architecture of domestic life can be co-opted into an industrial chamber of horrors. This unique aspect of the case forced a fundamental evolution in behavioral analysis, highlighting the critical role of secondary facilitators and the terrifying psychological capacity of ordinary adolescents to be corrupted into active participants in mass violence when stripped of moral guidance and subjected to the overwhelming influence of a charismatic, sociopathic mastermind. As the decades have continued to roll on, the memory of the Houston mass murders serves as a solemn, unyielding cautionary tale about the absolute fragility of social trust and the vital importance of institutional vigilance. The physical locations where the horrors once occurred have long since changed, replaced by new residential construction, repaved roads, and the relentless march of modern urban development that continually attempts to pave over the darkest, most painful chapters of local history. Yet, beneath the concrete, the asphalt, and the relentless passage of time, the dark echoes of 1973 remain a haunting, persistent presence, serving as a solemn reminder of a humid summer when the sun beat down mercilessly on a city that was bleeding from the inside out. The narrative of the Candy Man stands as one of the most profoundly chilling chapters in American criminal history, not simply because of the grotesque mechanics of the torture and murder, but because of how easily it happened, how quietly the victims vanished, and how completely the surrounding world failed to notice the systematic destruction of its youth until it was far too late. It is a story that demands to be told with unflinching sobriety, honoring the sacred memory of the victims by refusing to let them fade into quiet anonymity while probing the deep, uncomfortable truths about human vulnerability and the dark places where monsters can hide in plain sight. In the final, sobering analysis, the true tragedy of the Houston mass murders lies not only in 28 precious lives that were stolen, but in the permanent loss of an era of innocence that could never be reclaimed by society. The foundational idea that a neighborhood could act as a sanctuary of absolute safety was shattered forever, replaced by a modern, sober awareness that evil can wear a gentle smile, speak in a soft voice, and offer sweet rewards to those who are too young to know the devastating cost. The families who wept, the investigators who dug through the stifling dirt of the boat shed and the shifting sands of High Island, and the community that watched its children disappear one by one carried an unbearable burden that transcended generations. The names of the young men, though frequently overshadowed by the monstrous moniker of their killer, represent a solemn roster of lost human potential, a tragic testament to the destructive power of greed, betrayal, and unbridled sadism. As the history of those dark years is preserved in archives, textbooks, and the quiet reflections of those who survived, the ultimate lesson remains clear, stark, and unyielding. We must never look away from the shadows that hide behind bright smiles. We must listen attentively when the vulnerable speak out, and we must never take for granted the sacred trust that binds a community together, lest the darkness finds a way back through the front door, waiting patiently for the next innocent knock. As the decades march relentlessly forward, carrying the city of Houston further and further away from the sweltering, terrifying summer of 1973, the physical topography of the places that bore witness to the massacre continues to shift, adapt, and override itself in the name of modern progress. The residential streets of the Heights, once a quiet working-class sanctuary where children rode their bicycles without a care in the world, have undergone waves of gentrification, real estate development, and demographic renewal, transforming old, weathered houses into modern architectural showcases and replacing the overgrown empty lots with sleek urban dwellings. Yet, despite the fresh coats of paint, the newly paved asphalt, and the influx of a brand new generation of residents who walk these sidewalks completely unaware of the horrors that once transpired beneath the surface, the dark historical footprint of the Candyman remains an invisible, persistent undercurrent, a spectral presence embedded deep within the collective memory of the city. It is a peculiar kind of haunting, one that does not manifest in creaking floorboards or phantom whispers, but rather in the quiet, lingering knowledge that profound malevolence can inhabit the most mundane corners of ordinary life. The houses that served as slaughterhouses have been remodeled, torn down, or obscured by time, but the echoes of the young lives that were extinguished within their walls continue to reverberate through the annals of American true crime, serving as a permanent, solemn reminder of a time when the innocence of an entire community was violently ripped away from the inside out. The enduring resonance of the Dean Corll case within contemporary true crime discourse and criminological research highlights a fundamental shift in how society examines the anatomy of mass violence and serial predation. In the years following the discoveries at the boat shed and the remote burial sites, forensic experts, criminal psychologists, and investigative journalists have continually revisited the case files to dissect the complex psychological machinery that allowed such a monstrous enterprise to function in plain sight for over 3 years. What makes the Houston mass murders continue to capture the morbid fascination and analytical scrutiny of researchers is not merely the gruesome scale of the body count or the horrific nature of the physical torture, but the terrifying efficiency of the codependent social structure that Corll meticulously engineered. Unlike the archetypal Hollywood serial killer, a solitary, nocturnal figure operating completely detached from society, hunting strangers on dark highways, Corll operated as the hidden center of a web of teenage compliance, weaponizing peer relationships, financial desperation, and chemical dependency to transform ordinary local youths into the primary instruments of their own community's destruction. This complex dynamic forced an evolution in how behavioral analysts understand the vulnerabilities of adolescents caught in the liminal space between childhood and independence, demonstrating with clinical precision how easily the social fabric can be frayed when a charismatic, sociopathic mastermind systematically exploits the natural human desire for belonging, excitement, and financial autonomy. The broader cultural impact of the disaster also fundamentally altered the psychological relationship between American parents, children, and the concept of neighborhood safety, dismantling forever the naive assumption that familiar surroundings provide an absolute shield against danger. Before 1973, the prevailing social contract of working-class American neighborhoods operated on an implicit, unquestioned foundation of communal trust, where a friendly face, a local business owner, or a familiar neighborhood teenager was automatically categorized as safe, harmless, and benevolent. The revelation that the mild-mannered man who handed out free candy could simultaneously orchestrate one of the most prolific and depraved mass slaughters in the nation's history ruptured that trust irrevocably, ushering in an era of heightened vigilance, parental anxiety, and institutional caution that persists to this very day. The freedom that defined early 70s adolescence, the unmonitored bicycle rides, the endless summer days spent exploring parks and diners without checking in, and the expectation of returning home only when the streetlights flickered on, was gradually replaced by a modern culture of supervision, scheduled activities, and digital tracking. While these societal shifts undoubtedly enhanced physical security in many ways, they also carried a profound cultural cost, permanently altering the way young people experience the world and replacing the open, uninhibited innocence of youth with a sober, ever-present awareness of the hidden darkness that can lurk behind a gentle smile and a polite greeting. Moreover, the profound institutional trauma experienced by the families of the victims catalyzed a sweeping, long-overdue revolution in how law enforcement agencies across the United States handle missing persons reports, particularly those involving teenagers and young adults. The heartbreaking bureaucratic negligence that characterized the initial police response to the disappearances in Houston, where frantic parents were turned away with cynical assumptions about rebellious runaways while their sons were being systematically slaughtered just blocks away, became a glaring, indefensible symbol of systemic failure that no modern police department could ever afford to repeat. In the wake of the mass grave excavations, law enforcement protocols underwent a rigorous modernization, prioritizing proactive investigations, cross-jurisdictional data sharing, standardized missing youth databases, and the immediate deployment of forensic resources rather than waiting weeks or months for administrative assumptions to be proven wrong. The families of the 28 victims, through their unrelenting grief, their public activism, and their refusal to let the silence of bureaucracy swallow the memory of their children, forced the justice system to acknowledge its own vulnerabilities and reform its practices to ensure that future generations of missing children would receive the urgent, compassionate attention they deserved. Their enduring legacy is written into every modernized protocol, every shared database, and every proactive investigation that saves a child from falling through the cracks of institutional apathy. As the decades continue to pass and the physical participants in the tragedy gradually fade from the stage of history, with David Brooks having passed away in prison and Elmer Wayne Henley continuing to serve his life sentence behind impenetrable concrete walls, the burden of remembrance falls heavily upon the collective consciousness of those who study, record, and reflect upon the darkest chapters of human history. The 28 young men whose lives were so brutally cut short remain forever frozen in time through faded school portraits, family scrapbooks, and solemn police archives, serving as a poignant, heartbreaking reminder of unfulfilled potential and stolen futures. They were individuals with distinct personalities, cherished dreams, and deep familial bonds, not merely numbers in a tragic criminal statistic, and their humanity must always remain at the center of any retrospective analysis of the case. The temptation in true crime narratives is often to focus obsessively on the pathology of the monster, to dissect the mechanics of the torture, and to analyze the psychology of the accomplices. But true justice requires an unwavering commitment to honoring the victims, listening to the surviving families, and acknowledging the profound, permanent scar left upon the community that loved them. The final, lingering resonance of the Houston mass murders is not found in the grim statistics of the graves or the chilling details of the torture chamber, but in the profound, unyielding truth about human nature and the fragile architecture of civilization. It stands as a solemn warning that evil does not always wear a terrifying mask or lurk in the shadows of the unknown, but can walk among us in broad daylight, wearing the familiar clothes of a neighbor, speaking in a soft and gentle voice, and offering sweet rewards to those who are too young and too trusting to recognize the trap. It teaches us that the preservation of safety and community requires more than just locks on doors and vigilance on the streets. It requires active empathy, genuine listening, attentive care for the vulnerable, and an unwavering refusal to look away from uncomfortable truths when something does not feel right. The Candyman case remains an indelible chapter of American history, a dark monument to a humid Texas summer when the world lost its innocence, reminding us for all time that we must protect our youth, cherish our trust, and remain ever watchful for the shadows that hide behind the brightest smiles, ensuring that the horrors of the past are never forgotten, never repeated, and forever met with the unyielding light of truth, justice, and enduring remembrance. As the final reflections on the dark history of the Houston mass murders settle into the broader archives of American true crime, the most vital and enduring responsibility left for society is the active preservation of the memories of those who were lost. For decades, the morbid fascination of the public and the media has naturally gravitated toward the chilling pathology of Dean Corll, the mechanics of the torture chamber, and the shocking betrayal of the teenage accomplices. Yet a truly mature and respectful engagement with such profound tragedy requires an intentional shift in focus away from the perpetrators of violence and back toward the human beings whose lives were cut short. The 28 young men and boys whose names are permanently etched into the sorrowful history of the 1970s were not merely statistical markers in a criminal investigation or grim curiosities in a book of horrors. They were individuals with distinct personalities, unwritten futures, and deep, enduring bonds of love within their families. They were sons who brought laughter into their homes, brothers who shared childhood secrets, and friends who walked the neighborhood streets with boundless hope and youthful ambition. To let their stories be overshadowed entirely by the monstrous moniker of their killer is to commit a secondary injustice, stripping them of their humanity and reducing their existence to the brutal manner of their deaths. Keeping their memories alive requires honoring their humanity, acknowledging the unmeasurable void their absences left behind, and recognizing that every single one of them deserved a full, unhindered life that was stolen by greed, cruelty, and moral collapse. The families who survived them carried an unbearable burden, walking through the rest of their lives under the heavy shadow of an unspeakable grief. Yet their resilience and their relentless demand for truth stand as a powerful testament to the enduring strength of familial love in the face of absolute darkness. They fought to ensure that their children would never be forgotten, transforming their private agony into a public warning and demanding that the justice system confront its own failings so that no other family would ever have to experience the agonizing limbo of a missing child swallowed by institutional apathy. Their enduring advocacy became a silent force for change, weaving itself into the very fabric of modern investigative protocols and ensuring that the painful lessons learned from the Houston mass murders would serve as a protective shield for future generations of young people. It is through this lens of remembrance, empathy, and institutional vigilance that the true weight of the tragedy is properly contextualized, moving beyond the initial shock of the headlines to confront the deeper, more complex truths about human vulnerability, community responsibility, and the fragility of social trust. The narrative of the Candyman remains an essential, unyielding chapter of American history precisely because it forces society to look directly into the uncomfortable corners where light rarely reaches, challenging the comforting illusions of safety that people so often take for granted in their daily lives. It teaches a sobering, permanent lesson about the nature of evil, demonstrating that malice does not always announce itself with a terrifying visage or dwell exclusively in the shadows of the unknown, but can instead wear the familiar, comforting mask of a friendly neighbor, a generous mentor, or a trusted peer. This profound realization, born out of the humid Texas summer of 1973, fundamentally altered the cultural and psychological landscape of the nation, ushering in an era of heightened awareness, cautious protection, and a deep, abiding respect for the complex realities of adolescent vulnerability. As the physical locations where the horrors transpired continue to fade beneath the relentless march of modern urban development, repaved asphalt, and new residential construction, the historical footprint remains intact, preserved in court records, investigative files, and the collective memory of those who refused to let the past be conveniently paved over. The story demands to be told with unwavering sobriety, maintaining a delicate balance between examining the systemic failures that allowed the crimes to persist and honoring the sacred dignity of the victims whose voices were permanently silenced. It reminds everyone who listens, reads, or reflects upon these dark events that the preservation of a safe, compassionate community requires far more than locked doors and physical barriers. It demands genuine human connection, active listening, acute attentiveness to the vulnerable, and an absolute refusal to look away when something feels fundamentally wrong. The legacy of those lost young men lives on not only in the sorrow of their families and the permanent records of criminal history, but in the collective commitment of society to protect its youth, to cherish the sacred trust that binds neighborhoods together, and to ensure that the dark shadows of the past are forever met with the unyielding, luminous power of truth, justice, and enduring remembrance. As the comprehensive exploration of the Houston mass murders reaches its final movement, it becomes increasingly clear that the true significance of this dark historical chapter extends far beyond the gruesome details of the crimes or the clinical chronology of the legal proceedings. The legacy of Dean Corll and his accomplices occupies a unique and deeply unsettling space in the annals of American true crime, functioning not merely as a horrifying anomaly of a bygone era, but as a profound cultural touchstone that permanently altered how society perceives the hidden vulnerabilities embedded within everyday life. When we look back across the decades to the sweltering summer of 1973, we are confronted not just with the physical evidence recovered from the boat shed and the coastal dunes, but with a lingering, philosophical question about the nature of human evil and the delicate, often invisible barriers that separate safety from catastrophe. The narrative of the Candyman forces us to abandon the comforting myth that danger always wears an obvious disguise or operates exclusively in the remote margins of the world, reminding us with unyielding sobriety that the most devastating predators are often those who successfully integrate themselves into the fabric of normalcy, weaponizing trust and masking their malice behind a gentle smile and a familiar face. This realization, forged in the fires of an unimaginable local tragedy, initiated a fundamental psychological shift in the American consciousness, replacing uncritical communal trust with a mature, vigilant awareness that reshaped family dynamics, parenting philosophies, and the institutional responsibilities of local communities for generations to come, creating a permanent cultural checkpoint where innocence could no longer be taken for granted. The ripples of the 1973 investigation extended far beyond the immediate boundaries of Texas, catalyzing a quiet, radical evolution in the fields of forensic science, behavioral analysis, and criminal profiling across the entire law enforcement landscape of the United States. Before the Houston mass murders forced law enforcement agencies to confront the grim realities of multi-person serial predation operating within domestic environments, traditional investigative methods were often rigidly compartmentalized, relying heavily on immediate physical evidence, isolated witness accounts, and reactive responses to missing persons reports. The sheer scale of the Corll case, characterized by decentralized burial sites, teenage accomplices acting as human bait, and the systemic exploitation of social trust, exposed critical vulnerabilities in how law enforcement agencies coordinated across municipal, county, and state lines during an era of profound cultural upheaval. In the wake of the mass grave excavations, criminologists and investigators were forced to reevaluate the behavioral profiles of serial offenders, recognizing with clinical precision that sociopathic masterminds frequently rely on secondary facilitators, peer manipulation, and the psychological control of impressionable youths to expand their operational reach while maintaining an outer facade of utter harmlessness. This analytical breakthrough contributed significantly to the development of modern investigative methodologies, leading to enhanced interagency data sharing, standardized databases for missing and unidentified persons, and a much more sophisticated understanding of the complex psychological dynamics that enable predators to hide in plain sight. The harrowing lessons learned from the failures and eventual breakthroughs of the 1973 investigation became foundational case studies for future generations of detectives and forensic experts. ensuring that the horrifying sacrifices of the victims were translated into institutional knowledge that would ultimately prevent future tragedies and sharpen the nation's capacity to protect its most vulnerable populations from sophisticated forms of interpersonal exploitation. Yet, beneath the clinical analyses of criminologists and the institutional reforms of law enforcement, the deepest and most enduring impact of the tragedy remains rooted in the human dimension of grief, loss, and community memory that time can never fully erode. A city like Houston, which experienced such a profound violation of its social fabric, carries a complex, generational burden that cannot be easily measured by statistics, court transcripts, or legal verdicts. The neighborhoods where the horrors transpired have changed utterly, transformed by the relentless march of urban development, real estate renewal, and the passage of time. Yet the emotional geography of the area remains indelibly marked by the events of 1973. For the families who survived the nightmare, the passage of time does not erase the pain. It merely changes its shape, transforming the acute agony of initial loss into a quiet, enduring sorrow that accompanies every milestone, holiday, and family gathering where an empty chair serves as a silent monument to a stolen future. The resilience demonstrated by these families, who refuse to let the silence of bureaucratic apathy swallow the names and faces of their children, stands as a powerful testament to the unbreakable strength of love in the face of absolute darkness. Their relentless advocacy ensured that the 28 young men were never reduced to mere footnotes in a criminal archive, but were remembered as cherished sons, brothers, and friends whose unwritten potentials deserve to be honored with unwavering dignity and respect. Their collective voice became a moral compass for the entire community, guiding society toward a deeper understanding of what it truly means to protect the innocent and demanding that justice remain vigilant long after the courtroom doors have closed and the media spotlight has faded into obscurity. In the broader context of true crime storytelling and cultural memory, the enduring fascination with the Dean Corll case carries both a profound responsibility and a cautionary lesson about the ethical boundaries of historical documentation and narrative representation. There is an inherent danger in the modern cultural appetite for true crime media, a temptation to sensationalize brutality, romanticize monstrosity, or reduce human tragedies to mere entertainment for morbid curiosity. To honor the true gravity of the Houston mass murders requires a deliberate rejection of sensationalism in favor of sober, empathetic, and rigorous storytelling that places the humanity of the victims at the absolute center of the narrative. When we examine the mechanics of the crimes, the failures of the institutions, and the pathology of the perpetrators, we must do so with a clear ethical purpose. To illuminate the dark corners where vulnerability is exploited, to challenge the complacent assumptions of safety that allow predators to operate unchecked, and to ensure that the voices of those who were silenced are never again drowned out by the noise of notoriety. The story of the Candy Man demands to be told not because it titillates the imagination with macabre details, but because it challenges our collective conscience, forcing us to confront uncomfortable truths about human nature, social trust, and our shared responsibility to look out for one another in an increasingly complex and interconnected world where evil can wear the mask of a friend. As this extensive examination of the Houston mass murders draws to its final close, the overarching narrative leaves us with a solemn and enduring meditation on the fragility of innocence and the eternal vigilance required to preserve it against the forces of darkness. The dark summer of 1973 will forever remain a profound scar on the historical landscape of America, a stark reminder of a time when a community's trust was weaponized against its own youth and 28 bright, promising lives were violently extinguished by greed, betrayal, and unbridled cruelty. Yet, even in the shadow of such profound darkness, the legacy of that era is ultimately defined not by the monstrous actions of the perpetrator, but by the resilience of the families who fought for truth, the dedication of the investigators who uncovered the hidden graves, and the collective commitment of a society that refused to let the victims fade into quiet anonymity. The names of those young men remain etched into the conscience of history, serving as a permanent, sorrowful reminder of what was lost and what must always be protected with unwavering dedication. We are left with the inescapable realization that safety is never guaranteed by mere physical boundaries or comforting illusions of normalcy. but is actively sustained through genuine empathy, attentive care for the vulnerable, and an unwavering courage to confront the shadows whenever they attempt to disguise themselves as light. By remembering the past with unflinching honesty, honoring the victims with profound respect, and maintaining an eternal watchfulness over our communities, we ensure that the tragic lessons of the Houston mass murders are never forgotten, standing as an unyielding testament to the power of truth, justice, and enduring remembrance. As we stand at the final horizon of this comprehensive exploration into one of the darkest and most harrowing chapters in American criminal history, we are compelled to look back not with a morbid fascination for the macabre, but with a profound, unyielding commitment to remembrance and truth. The story of Dean Corll, Elmer Wayne Henley, David Brooks, and the 28 young men whose lives were so brutally extinguished in the sweltering summers of early 1973 Houston has tested the very boundaries of how society comprehends human malevolence. Throughout this multi-part journey, we have navigated the quiet streets of the Heights neighborhood, examined the insidious mechanics of peer recruitment and financial exploitation, and confronted the devastating institutional failures that allowed a monster to operate in plain sight behind a comforting mask of normalcy. We have walked through the dark corridors of rented boat sheds, across the windswept dunes of High Island, and deep into the unforgiving wilderness of the San Jacinto County woods where the earth silently swallowed the lost youth of a generation. Yet, as the final pages of this dark archive are turned, the true measure of the tragedy cannot be found solely in the grim statistics of the excavation sites or the clinical details of the courtroom verdicts, but in the enduring human cost borne by those who were left behind to navigate a world forever altered by loss. The legacy of the Houston mass murders remains a stark, permanent reminder that evil does not always announce itself with a terrifying visage or dwell exclusively in the isolated margins of society. Instead, the most destructive predators are those who master the art of integration, wearing the familiar clothes of a friendly neighbor, speaking in soft and gentle tones, and offering sweet rewards to individuals who are simply too young and too trusting to recognize the lethal trap hidden beneath the surface. This profound realization shattered the comforting illusion of neighborhood sanctuary that defined working-class American life in the mid-20th century, forcing a painful, collective awakening to the reality that safety can never be taken for granted, and that community trust can be tragically weaponized against its most vulnerable members. The families of the victims bore the heaviest burden of this shattered illusion, living through the agonizing limbo of missing children followed by the catastrophic trauma of identifying plastic-wrapped remains coated in powdered lime. Their unwavering resilience, their fierce public advocacy, and their refusal to let bureaucratic apathy silence the memories of their loved ones transformed their private grief into a powerful force for institutional change. Because of their relentless dedication, law enforcement agencies across the nation were forced to modernize their investigative protocols, reevaluate how missing youth reports are handled, and recognize that administrative assumptions can be lethally dangerous. The painful lessons learned from the failures of 1973 became a vital protective shield for future generations, ensuring that the sacrifices of the 28 young men were never in vain, and that the justice system would approach missing person investigations with the urgency, rigor, and compassion they have always demanded. In the broader landscape of true crime storytelling and historical documentation, the exploration of such profound tragedies carries an immense ethical responsibility to prioritize the humanity of the victims above the sensationalism of the crimes. It is easy for public discourse to become obsessively fixated on the pathology of the perpetrator, to analyze the mechanics of the torture chamber, or to dissect the psychology of the accomplices, but true historical integrity requires an unwavering focus on the lives that were stolen. The 28 young men whose names and faces remain etched into the archives of this case were not mere footnotes in a criminal statistic or grim curiosities for morbid entertainment. They were sons who brought warmth to their homes, brothers who shared childhood dreams, and friends who walked the neighborhood streets with boundless hope and unwritten futures. Their distinct personalities, their individual aspirations, and the deep familial bonds they left behind deserve to be honored with profound dignity and respect, ensuring that their memories are preserved not as victims of a monster, but as human beings whose potential was wrongfully denied by greed, cruelty, and moral collapse. Keeping their stories alive is a solemn duty that falls upon everyone who reflects upon this dark history, serving as a constant reminder that behind every criminal case file lies a human heart, a grieving family, and a community that was forever fractured by the absence of someone they loved. As the physical locations where these horrors transpired continue to be reshaped by modern urban development, repaved asphalt, and the relentless march of time, the historical footprint of the Candy Man remains an invisible yet persistent undercurrent in the cultural memory of Houston and the nation at large. The houses have changed, the empty lots have been built over, and the original participants in the tragedy have either passed away in prison or continued to serve their long sentences behind impenetrable concrete walls. But the lessons of that humid summer remain stark, unyielding, and profoundly relevant to the modern world. The narrative challenges us to look beyond the surface of everyday life, to listen attentively when the vulnerable speak out, to foster genuine human connections within our neighborhoods, and to maintain an eternal vigilance against the shadows that attempt to disguise themselves as light. It reminds us that the preservation of a safe, compassionate society requires active empathy, acute attentiveness, and the courage to confront uncomfortable truths whenever something feels fundamentally wrong, ensuring that we never look away from the warning signs that could prevent a future tragedy. In the final, quiet analysis, this extensive narrative concludes not with a neat resolution or a comforting sense of closure, but with a lingering, meditative awareness of the fragility of innocence and the enduring strength of the human spirit. The dark chapter of the Houston mass murders will forever remain a profound scar on the landscape of American history, a solemn monument to a time when trust was betrayed and 28 bright lives were tragically cut short. Yet, even in the deepest shadow of such profound sorrow, the legacy of those years is ultimately defined by the resilience of those who fought for truth, the dedication of those who uncovered the hidden graves, and the collective commitment of a society that refuses to let the victims fade into quiet anonymity. The names of those young men remain a sacred roster of lost potential, reminding us for all time to protect our youth, to cherish the bonds that hold our communities together, and to ensure that the dark lessons of the past are met forever with the unyielding, luminous power of truth, justice, and enduring remembrance. As the echoes of this dark chapter fade into the deep archives of criminal history, we are left to contemplate the profound weight that remains when the shock of the headlines has long since dissipated. The narrative of the Houston mass murders is not merely a record of atrocities committed in the dark corners of a Texas summer. It is a permanent examination of the fragility of human trust and the terrifying ease with which the normal and the monstrous can intertwine. When we look back across the decades, past the excavated boat sheds and the shifting coastal sands, we are confronted by the sobering reality that history is defined not just by the grand movements of societies, but by the quiet, devastating moments when individual lives are snuffed out by greed, betrayal, and unbridled cruelty. The 28 young men whose stories we have uncovered were not statistics or abstract figures in a criminological study. They were sons, brothers, classmates, and friends whose unwritten futures were stolen away in an environment that promised safety but delivered an unimaginable nightmare. Their memories demand our deepest respect, requiring us to look beyond the clinical pathology of the perpetrator and honor the human dignity of those who were lost, ensuring that their names are never swallowed by the silence of time. The families who survived them carried an unbearable cross, navigating a lifelong journey of grief, unanswered questions, and the agonizing realization that the world could be so profoundly broken. Yet their resilience stands as a powerful testament to the enduring strength of love in the face of absolute darkness. They fought tirelessly to ensure that their children would never be forgotten, transforming their private sorrow into a public vigil that permanently reshaped how law enforcement agencies approach the missing and the vulnerable. Their legacy is woven into the very fabric of modern investigative protocols, serving as an eternal reminder that institutional apathy is a lethal danger and that every missing child deserves an immediate, relentless pursuit of truth. The institutional failures of 1973 forced a painful, necessary awakening across the American criminal justice system, dismantling the dangerous bureaucratic assumptions that allowed a prolific predator to hunt in plain sight for over 3 years. Criminologists and behavioral analysts continue to study the intricate dynamics of the case, recognizing how a sociopathic mastermind successfully weaponized peer relationships, financial incentives, and chemical dependency to construct a decentralized network of horror. Yet, beneath the academic analyses and the legal frameworks lies the unchanging human truth of what happened when the social contract was shattered from within. The neighborhoods of the Heights, though transformed by the relentless march of urban development and modern gentrification, remain marked by the invisible footprints of a tragedy that forever altered the community's collective consciousness. The physical houses have been remodeled or replaced, the dirt floors of the boat sheds have been paved over, and the original participants in the darkness have either faded into the prison system or passed away in confinement. But the lessons of that humid summer remain stark, unyielding, and profoundly relevant to the modern world. The Candyman case teaches us that evil does not always wear a terrifying disguise or lurk in the desolate fringes of society. Instead, it can wear the comforting mask of a friendly neighbor, speaking in soft tones and offering sweet rewards to those who are simply too young and too trusting to recognize the trap. This profound realization stripped away the comforting illusions of mid-century American life, initiating a cultural shift toward a more cautious, vigilant awareness of adolescent vulnerability and the hidden dangers that can accompany everyday normalcy. As we preserve these dark events in the records of history, we carry a sacred responsibility to maintain an eternal watchfulness, ensuring that we never take for granted the sacred trust that binds communities together and never look away from the warning signs when something feels fundamentally wrong. The narrative challenges us to foster genuine human connections, to listen attentively when the vulnerable speak out, and to maintain the courage to confront uncomfortable truths whenever safety is threatened by the forces of deception. In the final, quiet analysis, this extensive exploration concludes not with a neat resolution or a comforting sense of closure, but with a lingering, meditative awareness of the fragility of innocence and the enduring strength of the human spirit in the face of unimaginable sorrow. The dark chapter of the Houston mass murders will forever remain a profound scar on the landscape of American history, a solemn monument to a time when trust was betrayed and 28 bright lives were tragically cut short before they had truly begun. Yet, even in the deepest shadow of such profound grief, the legacy of those years is ultimately defined by the resilience of those who fought for truth, the dedication of those who uncovered the hidden graves, and the collective commitment of a society that refuses to let the victims fade into quiet anonymity. The names of those young men remain a sacred roster of lost potential, reminding us for all time to protect our youth, to cherish the bonds that hold our communities together, and to ensure that the dark lessons of the past are met forever with the unyielding, luminous power of truth, justice, and enduring remembrance, standing as an eternal beacon against the shadows that attempt to disguise themselves as light.